Do you know that the civilization that invented democracy, philosophy, the Olympic Games, theater, mathematics, and the very foundations of Western science, a civilization so advanced that its ideas still shape every government, every university, and every courtroom on Earth today, destroyed itself? Not by a foreign invasion, not by a plague, not by a natural disaster. Ancient Greece, the greatest civilization the Western world had ever produced, was brought down primarily by its own decisions, its own rivalries, its own pride, its own inability to stop fighting itself long enough to survive. At its height, ancient Greece produced Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, three men whose ideas about the nature of reality, justice, knowledge, and the human soul we are still debating today. It produced Pericles, who built the Parthenon. It produced Leonidas, who held the pass at Thermopylae with 300 men. It produced Alexander, who would go on to conquer the known world. And then it tore itself apart, city by city, war by war, decision by decision. This is the story of how the greatest civilization in the ancient Western world rose from almost nothing, and how it destroyed itself at the exact moment it should have been unstoppable. The world before Greece. To truly understand what Greece achieved and what its destruction cost the world, we need to understand where it began. Around 800 BC, the Greek world was not a unified nation. It was not an empire. It was a scattered collection of small, independent communities clinging to the rocky coastlines and islands of the Aegean Sea. The land itself was difficult, mountainous, dry, not naturally suited to the kind of large-scale agriculture that had allowed Egypt and Mesopotamia to build their great river civilizations. The Greeks had no Nile. They had no Tigris or Euphrates. What they had was the sea and each other. These early communities were called polis, city-states. Each one was essentially a self-governing mini-nation with its own laws, its own currency, its own army, its own identity, and its own fierce pride. Athens was one, Sparta was another, Corinth, Thebes, Argos, Miletus, all separate, all independent, all deeply aware of their differences. And it was precisely this fragmentation, this refusal to be absorbed into a single unified state that both created Greek civilization and ultimately destroyed it. Because when you cannot conquer your neighbors and you cannot ignore them, you are forced to compete with them. And competition, when it involves the sharpest minds in the ancient world, produces extraordinary things. The rise. Between approximately 800 and 500 BC, something extraordinary happened in the Greek world. A period that historians call the Archaic period saw the Greek city-states begin to develop at a pace that was, by any historical measure, staggering. They developed the first phonetic alphabet in the Western world, a writing system so efficient that it became the foundation for Latin, and through Latin for virtually every alphabet used in the Western world today. They developed coinage, the concept of standardized money that could be trusted and traded across borders. They developed the concept of natural law, the idea that the world operates according to principles that can be observed, tested, and understood through reason, rather than explained through divine will alone. This last development was perhaps the most revolutionary thing any civilization had ever produced. When the philosopher Thales of Miletus declared around 585 BC that the world could be explained through natural causes rather than the actions of gods, he planted a seed that would eventually grow into science, medicine, mathematics, and every field of rational human inquiry that followed. And then came the political revolution. In 508 BC, an Athenian reformer named Cleisthenes introduced a system of governance that had never existed anywhere in the world before. He called it Demokratia, people power. For the first time in recorded human history, ordinary male citizens, not priests, not aristocrats, not kings, were given a direct vote in the decisions that governed their own lives. The idea was so radical, so completely without precedent, that it took the rest of the world over 2,000 years to fully adopt it. We are still living inside the system that Cleisthenes invented on a rocky peninsula in the Aegean in 508 BC. But the greatest test of the Greek world was about to arrive, and it would come not from within, but from the east, from the largest empire the world had ever seen. The test of fire. In 490 BC, the Persian Empire, the largest, wealthiest, and most powerful political entity on earth, sent an army to Greece. The Persian king Darius the Great had decided that the Greek city-states, which had been interfering in Persian affairs and supporting rebellions in Persian-controlled territory, needed to be brought to heel. The Persian army that landed at the Bay of Marathon was, by ancient estimates, somewhere between 15,000 and 60,000 men strong. The Athenian army that marched out to meet it numbered approximately 10,000 soldiers. They had no Persian cavalry to support them. No allies had yet arrived. They were, by every rational calculation, going to lose. What happened at Marathon on that September morning in 490 BC became one of the defining moments in all of Western history. The Athenian general Miltiades devised a tactical formation, deliberately weakening the center of the line while strengthening the wings, that allowed his outnumbered army to envelop the Persian force and drive it back to the sea. The Persians lost approximately 6,400 men. The Athenians lost 192. 10 years later, in 480 BC, the Persians came back, this time under Darius's son, Xerxes, this time with an army that ancient sources estimated at over 1 million men, a number modern historians believe is exaggerated, but which was certainly in the hundreds of thousands, the largest invasion force the ancient world had ever assembled. What followed over the next 2 years is one of the most extraordinary military campaigns in human history. Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans and 700 Thespians held a narrow mountain pass for 3 days against the full Persian army. Salamis, where the Athenian admiral Themistocles lured the massive Persian fleet into a narrow strait and destroyed it. Plataea, where a combined Greek army finally broke the Persian land forces and ended the invasion for good. Greece had survived. Against every reasonable expectation, the city-states had come together, fought together, and driven back the greatest empire in the world. And in the golden decade that followed, flush with victory and confidence and the sense that anything was possible, the Greeks produced the greatest flowering of human thought and art and architecture that the ancient world had ever seen. The Golden Age. The period between approximately 479 and 431 BC is known as the Golden Age of Athens, and the name is not an exaggeration. Under the leadership of the statesman Pericles, Athens became the cultural and intellectual capital of the known world.
The Parthenon was built on the Acropolis, a temple so perfectly proportioned, so masterfully constructed, that architects and mathematicians still study it today to understand how its builders achieved optical effects that modern engineering struggles to replicate. Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides were writing the world's first great theatrical dramas, plays so psychologically sophisticated that they are performed in theaters around the world 2,500 years later. Herodotus was inventing the discipline of history, the systematic recording and analysis of past events. Socrates was walking the streets of Athens asking questions that made powerful men so uncomfortable they eventually put him on trial for his life. The Athenian economy was thriving. The city's silver mines at Laurion produced enormous wealth. The Delian League, a military alliance of Greek city-states that Athens led, gave Athens access to tribute from across the Aegean. The population of Athens at its peak was approximately 300,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the ancient world. It was, by almost any measure, the most intellectually fertile city in human history up to that point, and possibly since. But beneath the golden surface of Periclean Athens, a tension was building. A tension that would become the fault line along which Greek civilization would eventually split apart.
The fault line. The tension that would destroy Greece was not new. It had existed since the earliest days of the city-states. It was the tension between Athens and Sparta, two cities that had fought side by side against Persia, but could not have been more different from each other in every other respect. Athens was democratic, intellectual, commercial, creative, maritime, and outward-looking. It valued debate, art, philosophy, trade, and the free exchange of ideas. Its power came from its navy, its economy, and the extraordinary quality of its thinking. Sparta was oligarchic, militaristic, agricultural, insular, and land-based. It valued discipline, obedience, physical endurance, and the subordination of the individual to the collective. Its power came from its army, the finest infantry force the ancient world had ever produced. A Spartan soldier trained from the age of 7 until the age of 60. There was nothing in Greece, and arguably nothing in the world, that could stand against a Spartan phalanx in open battle. These two cities had managed to coexist barely during the Persian Wars, united by the common threat from the east. But once the Persians were defeated, the common threat was gone, and what remained was two incompatible visions of what Greece should be, backed by the two most powerful military forces in the Greek world. Athens had been using the Delian League, the defensive alliance that was supposed to protect the Greek world from future Persian aggression, as an instrument of Athenian imperial expansion. Athens moved the Delian League's treasury from the island of Delos to Athens itself. Athens used League tribute money to build the Parthenon. Athens began treating its allies less like partners and more like subjects. Sparta watched all of this with growing alarm, and Sparta's allies, particularly Corinth, which had commercial rivalries with Athens, began pressing Sparta to act. The fault line was complete. The earthquake was coming.
The decision that broke the world. In 431 BC, the Peloponnesian War began. It would last 27 years, and it would change everything. The war was not a single battle or a short campaign. It was a grinding, devastating, multi-generational conflict that dragged every major Greek city-state into its orbit and consumed them all. Athens against Sparta, democracy against oligarchy, the sea against the land, two visions of civilization fighting each other to exhaustion. In the early years of the war, Athens made a decision that would alter the course of the conflict completely. Rather than risk its army against Sparta's superior infantry in open battle, the Athenian strategy, devised by Pericles, was to retreat behind the city's massive walls, allow Sparta to ravage the Athenian countryside, and use Athens' superior navy to raid Spartan coastal territory. A strategy of patience, of endurance, of letting time and economics do what the army could not. It was a sound strategy. It might even have worked. But in 430 BC, a plague entered Athens through its port at Piraeus. It spread through the overcrowded city with devastating speed. Modern analysis of ancient descriptions suggests it may have been typhoid fever or possibly Ebola, or a disease that no longer exists in its original form. Whatever it was, it killed approximately 1/4 to 1/3 of the entire Athenian population in just a few years. It killed soldiers, citizens, and slaves indiscriminately. And it killed Pericles, the man who had guided Athens through its golden age, who had built the Parthenon, who had crafted the strategy that gave Athens its best chance of surviving the war, died of the plague in 429 BC. He was around 65 years old, and Athens, without him, was never quite the same.
The Sicilian Catastrophe. Of all the decisions that Athens made during the Peloponnesian War, none was more catastrophic, none more perfectly illustrates how a great civilization can destroy itself through hubris and overreach than the Sicilian expedition of 415 BC. Athens decided, in the middle of an already exhausting war with Sparta, to launch a massive military campaign against Syracuse, the largest and most powerful city on the island of Sicily, on the complete other side of the Mediterranean. The stated justification was to help a Sicilian ally. The actual motivation was Athenian imperial ambition, the belief that conquering Sicily would give Athens the resources and the strategic position to finally win the war against Sparta. It was the most ambitious military operation in Athenian history. A fleet of over 200 triremes, warships, carrying approximately 40,000 soldiers and sailors, set sail for Sicily. It was a breathtaking display of Athenian power and confidence. It was also a catastrophic miscalculation. The campaign went wrong almost immediately. The Athenian commander, Alcibiades, the charismatic but deeply unreliable general who had championed the expedition, was recalled to Athens on charges of impiety before the campaign even properly began. He defected to Sparta instead of returning home, and immediately began advising the Spartans on how to defeat his former city. The remaining commanders were not up to the task. The Syracusans fought harder than expected. Sparta sent reinforcements. The Athenian fleet, trapped in the harbor of Syracuse, was destroyed in a naval battle. The army that tried to retreat overland was hunted down, captured, and put to work in the stone quarries of Syracuse, where most of them died of exposure, thirst, and disease. Of the 40,000 Athenians who sailed for Sicily, almost none returned. It was the single greatest military disaster in Athenian history, and the city never fully recovered. The fall.
Athens struggled on for another decade after Sicily. It was a remarkable demonstration of the city's resilience and the depth of its resources, but the Sicilian catastrophe had broken something fundamental in Athenian power and Athenian confidence. In 404 BC, after 27 years of war, Athens surrendered to Sparta. The long walls that connected Athens to its port at Piraeus, the walls that had been the foundation of Athenian naval strategy, the walls that Pericles had said would keep Athens safe as long as they held, were torn down to the music of flutes by order of the Spartan victors. Ancient sources record that the Spartans and their allies celebrated the destruction of the walls as the beginning of Greek freedom. But Greek freedom did not follow. What followed instead was Spartan dominance, a dominance that proved just as oppressive and far less intellectually productive than Athenian leadership had been. The decades after Athens' defeat saw Greece tear itself apart in a new series of conflicts: Sparta versus Thebes, Thebes under the brilliant general Epaminondas defeating Sparta at the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC, ending Spartan military dominance forever. Then Theban dominance collapsing after Epaminondas' death. Then a new round of city-state conflict with no clear winner and no clear purpose. Greece was exhausted, depopulated by decades of war, its agricultural land ravaged, its treasury empty, its best minds scattered or dead. And to the north, watching all of this with cold, calculating interest, was a kingdom that the Greeks had long considered semi-barbaric, a kingdom called Macedon, and its king was a man named Philip II, whose son would become the most famous conqueror in all of history.
The final act. Philip II of Macedon spent the 350s and 340s BC methodically expanding Macedonian power southward, absorbing Greek city-states one by one through a combination of military force, diplomacy, bribery, and strategic marriage. The Greeks, exhausted from their decades of internal warfare, were in no position to mount a unified resistance. Some tried. The Athenian orator Demosthenes delivered a series of passionate speeches, known as the Philippics, warning Athens and the rest of Greece that Philip represented an existential threat to Greek freedom, and that the only response was immediate unified military action. In 338 BC, at the Battle of Chaeronea, Philip's army, which included his 18-year-old son Alexander commanding the Macedonian cavalry, defeated the combined forces of Athens and Thebes. It was the last time a coalition of Greek city-states would fight for their independence. Greece, as a collection of independent political entities, was finished. Philip was assassinated 2 years later. His son, Alexander, inherited the throne at 20 years old, spent 2 years consolidating his control over Greece, and then launched the campaign that would take him east, through Persia, through Egypt, through Central Asia to the borders of India, creating the largest empire the world had ever seen, and spreading Greek language, Greek culture, and Greek ideas across 3 continents. It is one of history's great ironies. The Greek civilization that had destroyed itself through internal division ended up, through Alexander's conquests, becoming the dominant cultural force across the entire known world. The ideas that Athens had produced, philosophy, democracy, theater, rational inquiry, outlasted the city-states that had been incapable of preserving them. What Greece tells us. The rise and fall of ancient Greece is not just a history lesson. It is a mirror. A civilization that produced more world-changing ideas per square kilometer than any society before or since, that invented democracy, philosophy, theater, the Olympic Games, The foundations of mathematics, medicine, and science was brought down not by an external enemy it could not defeat, but by its own inability to see past its rivalries, its pride, and its short-term interests. The Athenians and the Spartans were more similar to each other than either was to the Persians or the Macedonians. They spoke the same language, they worshipped the same gods, they competed in the same Olympic Games, and they spent 27 years doing everything in their power to destroy each other. The Sicilian expedition was not the act of a stupid civilization. It was the act of a brilliant one that had temporarily lost its wisdom, that had allowed its ambition to outrun its judgment, its confidence to outrun its caution. And yet the ideas survived. The plays of Sophocles survived. The dialogues of Plato survived. The mathematical proofs of Euclid survived. The democratic experiment survived, battered, imperfect, periodically extinguished and periodically reignited across 2,000 years of human history. Ancient Greece destroyed itself, but it could not destroy what it had created, and what it created is still alive.
Ancient Greece invented democracy and could not save itself. It produced the greatest philosophers in history and could not learn from their wisdom. It defeated the Persian Empire and then spent the next century defeating itself. It was the greatest civilization the Western world had ever produced, and it destroyed itself at the exact moment it should have been unstoppable. But its ideas, the ideas it planted in the rocky soil of the Aegean 2,500 years ago, are still growing in every democracy, in every courtroom, in every laboratory, in every theater, in every school where someone asks a question and expects a reasoned answer rather than an appeal to authority. The civilization fell, the ideas did not. If this changed how you see the ancient world, share this video with someone who needs to know. Subscribe to Ancient Curiouz and hit the notification bell so you never miss a fact that history forgot to tell you. New episodes every week, and I promise what we uncover next will be just as extraordinary as what you heard today. I will see you in the next one.